Welcome to Grounded Not Divided, a podcast about leaders who are getting important things done in the real world. I'm Matt Burgess. My guests on this show all have hard-won real-world experiences. Experiences that shed light rather than heat on society's most vital issues. Today's guest is Manu Meel. Manu is the CEO of Bridge USA, host of the Hopeful Majority podcast, and Forbes 30 Under 30. He also has experience as a Huffington Post contributor, a research intern at the American Enterprise Institute, and he had a stint working at the Department of State on countering violent extremism in Pakistan. Needless to say, a very interesting guy. Bridge USA is a large nonprofit organization that helps young people bridge their political divides, especially on college campuses. We are fortunate to have an excellent chapter here at the University of Wyoming called Bridge UYO. Unlike many other organizations fighting polarization, Bridge USA considers itself multi-partisan rather than non-partisan. Its members are welcome to have partisan allegiances, and Bridge does not force unity or compromise. Their lodestars are viewpoint diversity, constructive engagement, and a solution-oriented political culture. Manu and I discuss how Bridge started, its mission, and major polarization issues facing young people today. Manu Meel, welcome to Grounded Not Divided.
Matt, thank you for having me. Now we're on take 3 with the Wi-Fi, but I'm confident it's going to work this time.
We don't need our listeners to know that, but just kidding. I'm really excited to have you on. I'm a big fan of Bridge USA, the organization that you're a CEO of nationally. I'm a big fan of Ven Meester, who's the president of our local chapter, Bridge UYO, here at the University of Wyoming. So let's go back to the beginning. You started Bridge USA at UC Berkeley in 2017, not knowing how big it would get. Tell me that story.
Oh, that's exactly right. We had no idea how large it would get. I mean, you talk about building an organization to fight political polarization, and in 2024, that sounds just on brand. It sounds like it's important, but in 2017, which was my freshman year at UC Berkeley, that was certainly not the case when you talk about trying to build an organization to help young people talk across lines of political difference. You know, you mentioned Ven and you mentioned the work happening at UYO and all the other places that we're working on campuses. And the root of this work started my freshman year, February 2nd, 2017. This was 2.5 months after President Trump had first been elected. Now, at Cal, on that day, we had a speaker come to campus named Milo Yiannopoulos, who at that time was seen as a provocateur. Now, I distinctly remember I was walking back from my math seminar. It was evening time, and we heard protests in the distance, and we heard helicopters flying overhead. Now, as you can imagine, this is Berkeley, so protests are par for the course. There's nothing special about this thus far, and yet what was unique about this was I was walking past a cafe, and inside the cafe, the window was broken. It said CNN, UC Berkeley students protest free speech. Now, again, I had no idea what that meant because I was a pre-med student. I had no intention of building an organization, let alone trying to reduce political polarization in our country. The goal was to try and go into STEM. Now, what was also unique about those protests was they actually turned out to be the largest protest in Berkeley's history since the 60s when Dr. King came to campus. Now, imagine me, a pre-med student, walking through campus, watching CNN on TV covering my campus. And now as I step on a Sproul Plaza, which is our central area, the television crew that is filming that CNN segment is now standing right next to me. And that's the breaking of the fourth wall. That's when I went from feeling like I was just spectating democracy all my life to suddenly feeling like I'm actually a part of something that's happening. And I remember just the level of pain and anger. I mean, imagine students, outside agitators, folks all across the political spectrum protesting about somebody coming to campus. The next day, me and some random people, we got together because we felt the level of anxiety and challenge, this inability for people to actually hear each other, understand each other. And our thought process was, what if we created a space to invite the protesters, to invite the people that invited the speaker, to invite the campus administration, just to have a conversation? Now, you can imagine how naive of a proposition that was. And I'll leave it at that because that was the nugget that sort of sparked over the next few years this notion that if we don't have conversations with people that are different than us, then we don't have a democracy.
Okay.
before we move on, I want to follow up on one thing you said. You said at the end just now that if we can't have these kinds of conversations, we don't have a democracy, and you set out to have these kinds of conversations. But then you also said that setting out to have these kinds of conversations, with the protesters and those opposing them, in hindsight seems naive. So what do you mean by that?
In hindsight, it seemed naive. I think today it seems perceptive. And what I mean by that is, at that time, I think there was a dominant culture. And I think this culture, frankly, has existed for years. And I think only now we're starting to see the tide turning on this notion that we actually don't have to necessarily reconcile our differences as long as we prove our argument within our own echo chambers and hope that by proving our arguments within ourselves, we can essentially beat down the other side. And more than that, this notion that all you're going to do is have these conversations, what is that actually going to do to resolve the complex challenges of our democracy? I mean, you think about AI, you think about transformational change, you think about different issues, whether they're income inequality or various sort of political issues across the spectrum, gun control, free speech. And you're telling me that despite all those issues, step one is to have a conversation. That feels like you're taking a step back. And so what I mean by sort of that dichotomy between dialogues being seen as perceptive today, given where we are, versus naive back then, I think speaks to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs of our country and our society, where I think we're back to the basics, where if people don't understand how to live with difference and, more importantly, build upon each other's differences, then I don't think we actually have the core of what is needed for a deliberative democracy. Does that make sense?
It does. And you have this great quote on your LinkedIn, which I want to read, if you don't mind. You say, "We do not have a democracy if we don't engage. We do not have a country if we don't have some sense of unified belonging. We do not have a society if we cannot talk to each other." I really like that. And I don't know if you know this, probably you do at this point, but there's some social science behind what you're saying there.
That's right. I think, one of the first thinkers that I'd read when we were starting Bridge was a fascinating moral psychologist named Jonathan Haidt, whose work I'm sure you've come across. And he wrote this book called The Righteous Mind. John. Right. And John discusses this notion of moral foundations theory and the various values that motivate us and engage us. Now, again, at that time, I was a pre-med student with very little understanding of any of the theory behind the work. But I think we operated on a basic assumption. Actually, if I take you back to the next day after those protests, over that next week, we actually organized a conversation between the protesters and the people that they were protesting. And you could imagine people are showing up with their guards up and they're ready to argue. And you have that sense of that, people are walking on eggshells, right? That we feel so much today in society. And my friend Ross, who's one of the co-founders of Bridge, had this notion that let's forget about politics for a second. Let's actually talk about vulnerability. Let's open up our humanity. Let's show up and discuss not, why we invited a certain speaker or protested, but let's just talk about where we're from. What brings us together? What's the name of our mom? What motivates us? And those 90 minutes changed the trajectory of my life because they go precisely to your point about social science. We learned in that moment that we radically overestimate how divided we are, and we radically underestimate the power of a conversation as long as that conversation occurs in a structured, effective environment.
That's right. Yeah. And particularly structured so that no group is, all the groups that are coming together are equal in that setting. And to the extent that it can emphasize shared goals or shared humanity, common ground, like you said. But one of the other things I think is interesting about your approach, and I want to ask you about it quickly before we get into the rest of the history of Bridge, is that some organizations that focus on political polarization really focus on common ground as their lodestar. You guys have a bit more of a nuanced position, at least in my view or experience. And so you guys call yourselves a multi-partisan student movement. And one of the things you say in your website is, we do not force unity or compromise. And I've really seen that in, the local events on this campus that I've been to, that we want to understand each other, but we're not saying we have to disagree. But we do want to build empathy, and we don't want to exaggerate the extent to which we're divided. Where do you see is kind of the right balance there between, we're not necessarily expecting that we're all going to sing Kumbaya, and we're going to have some lasting disagreements, but we also want to find common ground and not exaggerate those disagreements. How'd you come up with that approach?
That's a great question, because I think it gets to the core of one of the notions and theory behind Bridge, and Ven can attest to this. I mean, huge shout out to Ven and all the work that he's doing at UIO. He can attest to when he came to our Bridge USA Summit, where we bring together all these students, right? And they're engaging, they're listening, they're talking, they're having conversations. And one of the central tenets of Bridge, as you said, is it's not about compromise, it's about understanding. And here's why. In 2019, 2 years into Bridge Berkeley, which is one of our first chapters that started after those protests, there was a fascinating insight I received. Someone said, Manu, do you suddenly think that people only started thinking about abortion in 2016? Do you think that people only suddenly started thinking about gun control in 2012? Do you think that people weren't debating free speech back in the 1770s, 1780s
Right.
at the founding of this country, right? The problem is not division. We've always been divided. And in fact, division is amazing. That's the engine of democracy. You got to be able to disagree. The problem is that I think we've forgotten the skills and ability to actually be able to productively disagree. Now, you might say, well, okay, so if you leave a Bridge conversation not having found some proverbial common ground, or as you said, the kumbaya point, but instead I just left having a better understanding of my, counterparts' arguments, what good does that do? And that's it. The good it does is I think we do not understand why people believe what they believe. And I think when you can start to understand, here's why this student believes in a more stricter border policy, perhaps because their family lives in the El Paso region of Texas. This happened at one of our discussions, and their family's been victimized by, illegal migrant crime, or this young woman is nervous about a stricter border policy because she has DACA status. Suddenly then you can actually start to build the foundation of humanity that I think enables us to build more effective policy.
Yeah, and also maybe helps you see issues where people are talking past each other, right? So, for example, take immigration. My understanding is that 2/3 or more of Americans want more border security, and they also want more merit-based immigration, and they also want permanent status for the DACA recipients. Those are not contradictory policies. You could have all three of those things if we decided we want to, and yet they feel like they are, right? Or abortion. Most something like 60% to 2/3 of Americans want third trimester abortions restricted and first trimester abortions not restricted. Again, you can have both of those things, but once you get lumped into a box of, where you have to kind of be on one side or the other, or, climate change. Most Americans want something done about climate change, but they also don't want their fossil fuels phased out on a rapid time scale, as three examples. So as you got into this disagree better framework, did you see a lot of these kinds of things? And what were issues, if any, where you saw kind of, no, actually, we really are as divided as we think we are for the reasons that we think we are?
The problem with everything that you just pointed out is it demands a whole lot of nuance, and that's it. It turns out that human beings are complex, right? And we have a lot of nuanced, multifaceted views on different things, whether it's abortion policy, immigration policy. And one of the things that has motivated, I think, the growth of our movement just in the last year, I mean, we started the year around 45 chapters. We're ending the year with 90 chapters. We just got our 2-week report, and we engaged 2,216 students just in the last 2 weeks across Bridge USA chapters. There's about 11,000 young people in the entire network. The reason for all of that is because the environment of complexity, the environment of nuance, is a hard environment for political leaders to navigate. My view is that it is actually easy for political leaders to keep us in a very binary yes, no, you're for abortion, against abortion, you're for open border, for closed border. It's easy in that binary because what it does is it simplifies the game. it simplifies the game. And our job is to start empowering young people. Forget disagreement for a second, forget compromise for a second. It's how do you actually disrupt a world in which we are fundamentally complex and being forced to put into boxes? And I think what motivates our students and our young people is we're actually choosing to opt out of the outrage industrial complex, which is a phrase that colleagues of mine like Amanda Ripley have coined. And it's this notion that outrage is easy, nuance is difficult. So ultimately, Bridge USA's job at an even, I think, more tactical level is not just to facilitate disagreements and facilitate productive conversations, but it's like, how do you actually effectuate norms change? How do you smash the culture of fear? How do you smash the culture of binary thinking? And importantly, when we start to fall into our binary thinking, I mean, we're talking about this a few days before Thanksgiving, right? The way you smash that culture of binary thinking is by educating people on recognizing that when we fall to our worst angels of putting each other into boxes, we're not actually helping ourselves. We're just helping those in power. And that's not effective at all.
Yeah. Okay. I want to come back to this, but let's go back to the history first. So Milo Yiannopoulos came to speak at UC Berkeley in 2017. There was a huge protest. It became a riot. I believe there was a fire. It was on TV. You organized this conversation. I think you said that the next day, or you started organizing the next day. You became a student group, Bridge, at UC Berkeley. What was the inflection point? Like, when did you decide that, we're going to go national with this? This is going to be my career. How did you describe the process of going from being a student leader running a successful club to, basically dedicating your life to this?
I know my mom is still confused, Matt. And so am I when I reflect and think about it. I'll actually asterisk the word successful because I actually think we failed much more in the early days than we succeeded. Whether it was around trying to know how to have a productive conversation, where to draw the red line on a conversation, trying to answer questions about free speech, trying to think about how do you actually moderate a constructive dialogue when someone's, let's say identity is on the line, right? All of those questions that I'm sure we'll get to. And so we failed a lot in those moments. And so the question actually to me became not should we build this organization or not? It was trying to reconcile something that we're seeing in reality that was different than what we were seeing in the perceived reality of the media. And that was that almost every person I talked to on campus after those protests, right? Almost every person we had conversations with on campus following a slew of different dialogues we held as Bridge Berkeley, we heard almost everywhere people saying, yeah, I want to have a conversation. I want to be open-minded. I want to be heard. I want to be listened to. I want to be able to debate and discuss. And yet the perceived reality was that we are incredibly divided. So I was trying to understand why is that? And I think the conclusion we came to, which really motivated me, was that the problem along the lines of it not being division is really that there's a large majority of people in our country, I think on our college campuses, in our high schools, in our work environments, that generally align with the Bridge mindset, right, of viewpoint diversity and conversation and listening. And yet we're all silent. We're all fearful. And there's a loud minority of voices across the political spectrum that dominate the conversation. And so what happens in a campus environment like Berkeley or UYO, or frankly in most of our communities, is that the majority of us that want to have the dialogues exit the space, and then the only people left are the loud vocal minority. And they operate by a different set of rules. Their rules are ideological rigidity and a notion that they win, you lose. It's a zero-sum mindset. And that dynamic of there being a silent majority that was being unheard and not being listened to, and that all we had to do was create as many of these spaces as possible, and importantly, elevate these stories of success to actually show people it is possible, that changed the game for us. And so it was tapping into, I think, an undercurrent that has only accelerated, I would say, over the last 5-6 years. And I think especially after this election, I am seeing a greater draw towards curiosity than I've ever seen before.
Yeah, so that's really interesting because one of the criticisms that bridge type groups sometimes get is that they're disproportionately engaging the people that, as the critics put it, are the people that they least need to be engaging, because they're the people who already value curiosity and pluralism and all these things. And it sounds like you're saying that maybe that's in some ways a feature more than it's a bug, because to put an analogy to it, we're not going to solve polarization in Congress probably through, Ilhan Omar singing Kumbaya with Marjorie Taylor Greene. We're going to, solve it more likely by everybody else kind of pushing them out of the way and getting on with their business. And so, let me phrase this as a question. And this is literally the title of an episode. This question is the title of an episode that I did in my previous podcast, the Free Mind podcast with Martine Carcassonne, who you might know, who's a dialogue facilitator in Colorado. And the episode was called, "Do Moderates Need to Be More Intolerant?" Right? Like how much of solving polarization is getting people from all across the spectrum to understand each other better, and how much of it is getting the silent majority on both sides to say, no, we're not going to let you wrap yourself in the American flag and light fires in the Capitol. And no, we're not going to let you wrap yourself in social justice rhetoric and pursue policies on crime and education that have been really materially harmful to the most disadvantaged among us. And where's the right balance between those two things? Because I kind of, my instinct is that there's value to both, but I'm still grappling with it.
I think it depends on what you define as success. So the title of our podcast is called The Hopeful Majority. And the reason why it's called The Hopeful Majority is because when you think about Martine's point about moderates being more intolerant, let's actually interrogate what a moderate is today.
And sorry, just to clarify, I was asking him the question. It was sort of an episode where he was helping me wrestle with my wondering if moderates need to be more intolerant. It wasn't him saying that. Just so I know we're not putting words in his mouth.
But it's a fascinating phrase, moderates being intolerant, right? So let's just pick that apart for a quick second. So first is what is a moderate? If you come to our Bridge USA Summit, and Ben can attest to this, you've got people from all over the political spectrum, different identities and backgrounds and demographic groups, and folks with different aspirations, people on very conservative viewpoints to people with very liberal viewpoints. And what they're united around is not their ideas or their ideology, what many think when they think moderate, this sort of squishy middle. They're united around a certain type of temperament, a way of engaging. In other words, they're united around a process. And so when I think about a moderate, I think about there actually being a new divide. And that divide is not between left to right. That divide is actually between the people that are open-minded and closed-minded. That divide is between people that want to have conversations in the pursuit of truth and the people that think that conversations get in the way of truth. And when you think about it in that way, the question then becomes, well, is it a question of intolerant versus tolerant, or is it a question of actually elevating this temperament and this mindset? I think that folks like Ilhan Omar and Marjorie Taylor Greene respond to the number 10. What is the number 10? You know this better than I do. The number 10 is the percentage of the electorate that shows up in a primary. The number 10 is the percentage of people that contribute to 87% of all user-generated content online. The number 10 are the loud voices in our local community neighborhoods that dominate the conversation while the other 90% of us are completely exhausted. And so to me, success is elevating the people that believe in this type of mindset and making their voices not only more heard and elevated, but actually responsive. And I'll just conclude this piece with a quick story. I was on the Hill about, I think, 2 or 3 months ago. It was in August. And there was a member of Congress that we were speaking with. And she said, Manu, I'm not a leader. I just represent people, which, by the way, is a whole philosophical viewpoint. But let's take it as is. And I said, okay, you represent people. What are the people out there saying? The people out there want me to be loud and vocal. And I think for a second, I said, really? Because I only see that as a part of your constituency, and that's it. It's about flipping the incentive structures. So to me, success means elevating the majority of people that align with the notion of pluralism and listening. not so that you're necessarily bridging, I think, between the extremes, because again, I don't think the goal is common ground. I think the goal is helping nuance dominate our politics so that outrage isn't the only incentive structure that people in power respond to.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And I really like and resonate with how you framed being a moderate. I remember one time I was at a conference and somebody asked me when I said that I was a moderate, does that mean you flip a coin on every issue? It's like, no.
Right.
It means that, I have moral clarity about intellectual seriousness. I think nuance and pluralism are important. And those are the things that are going to ultimately lead to a better society. And as a result of that mindset, the opinions that I currently hold on different issues that are always subject to revision don't neatly fit into one party or the other. But I want to ask you about, you talked about this dichotomy between open-minded and closed-minded, and I really like that. But I want to suggest that there might be a third category, which is something I've been wrestling with recently. And I think the third category is people who are open-minded and open-minded in a way that is, often appropriately distrustful of expert edicts, right? Especially when experts are kind of, saying, I'm an expert, listen to me, I don't have to show you my evidence, but then not sufficiently respectful of expertise, right? So I'm thinking about maybe, somebody who sees, for example, accurately that the scientific establishment told some deliberate lies during the pandemic, about, for example, the very beginning, they said masks didn't work because they wanted to hoard them for the healthcare workers. Then they did work. They said that lab leak was a Chinese conspiracy, or not a Chinese conspiracy theory, a racist conspiracy theory. And then, now half the intelligence community thinks that's what happened. Protesting was dangerous when it was conservatives in Michigan, and it was great when it was Black Lives Matter, et cetera, right? So an open-minded person could look at that and think, maybe I shouldn't always trust experts. But then I've encountered a lot of people who make that observation and then end up getting sucked into conspiratorial tinfoil hat rabbit holes about, vaccines and autism, to give one example, vaccines in general. This is just kind of the health version, but this thing happens in many, many other cases. And like, am I right that that's not, like, those people are kind of neither of the two categories you're talking about? Like you can have a conversation with them, but yet it seems like there's a problem. And the way I would characterize the problem is not understanding that as much as it may be the case that experts are fallible, expertise is still a thing and still important, right? If a doctor says something to me that I think is wrong, I'm still going to go ask another doctor for a second opinion. If a plumber tries to fix my sprinkler and doesn't work, I can see that they haven't fixed my sprinkler, but that doesn't mean I suddenly know how to fix my sprinkler, right? And so it kind of means you have to do more work, not less, to figure out what actually is true. And it feels to me like there's a segment of our discourse that I think started out in a similar place as you and me, of, we need to be more open-minded, we need to pursue truth and explore all different ideas, but then gets too easily sucked into these conspiracy rabbit holes. What's your take on that?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why do you think those folks get sucked into that rabbit hole?
I think it's a combination of two things. One, I think there's a reflex for skepticism that kind of serves them well initially, right? There's a reflex for nonconformism, not wanting to go along with something without the explanation why. And I think those are both good reflexes, but they can, if they're kind of applied without a lot of self-reflection, they can be kind of they can become binary, right? The experts are wrong this time doesn't mean that they're always wrong. And then the second thing is, like I said, the world is really hard to understand, and there's, it takes a lot of time and effort and, decades of wisdom to understand complex areas like medicine or like, earth science, the climate, to give two examples that come a lot in this area. And I think that Yeah, the idea that experts are fallible, I think, sometimes causes people to prematurely lose respect or lose appreciation for the fact that expertise is hard, is a real thing and it's hard to attain.
Mm. So it's fascinating. I'm going to use a personal anecdote that seems like it's starting out way in left field and then drive towards center field, if that's all right, to make sort of a broader point. I think building on your two pieces. When I was growing up, I was a super chubby Indian American kid that moved around every 2 years. I had very few friends. I lived in a village in India for the first 5 years of my life. I was born in the United States, but I lived with my grandparents while my parents lived in the U.S. I came back, moved around a bunch, finally went to high school in Boston. Throughout my childhood, there was constant movement. There was constant upheaval in my social life. I was also made fun of a lot. Felt like I was bullied in a lot of different circumstances and situations until I finally got to high school. All right. Now I had this childhood, and my reflex was skepticism about everything, because skepticism was my reflex to defend myself. And in fact, if I dug a little bit deeper, almost everyone that tried to actually send a hand and be a friend with me in high school, and as I got to college, I would immediately question, try to understand what's their angle, what's their point, almost the way that folks question experts and academics and people in authority, always operating with a defensive posture that turns into offense. And when I dug deeper than just skepticism, what I found was that I really was actually honestly just desiring to be heard. I just wanted to be a part of a community. I just wanted to start to trust again. And I think that, in a nutshell, describes a whole segment of the American population, whether it's bisected by race, class, gender, ethnicity, you name it. I think that there is a lot of mistrust. There's a lot of skepticism, largely motivated by loneliness, by a lack of purpose, by feeling like they can't be heard, feeling like they're screaming into a void. And as a result, when you ask those folks, well, let's actually engage in politics or in democracy, I think that engagement manifests in what some might call the anti-establishment backlash. And I think at the core of it is not that those folks are not open-minded. I think at the core of it is that my middle school self was simply seeking to be in a community where people would listen to me. And the moment I felt like I could trust somebody and build a real and honest friendship, the whole ballgame changed, because suddenly I actually felt disproven about my immediate reflex for mistrust. I say all of that because I think that bridging communities, civic spaces, conversation environments, whether people feel fundamentally challenged about their identity or people feel fundamentally betrayed by so-called people in power, to get to those folks, we've got to be able to create the spaces where they actually feel heard. Now, someone might counter and say, well, what if they just show up in that space and say they're conspiracy theory? Well, here's my viewpoint on this, is that conspiracy theories only harden when you leave them in a vacuum. I think if you really think about exposure, the first step to exposure is actually bringing them into a space where they feel like, okay, I'm actually going to put my thought out, not in a reflexively skeptical way, but in a way to articulate, here's what I think. And then I think we ask them the follow-up question. And the follow-up question, one of the most powerful questions I think in the English language, is what my friend Monica Guzman has written about, is tell me more. You ask somebody, tell me more. Suddenly, the light in their mind goes from, I'm being attacked, to, oh my God, this person's curious. And that's how I think we break through. I know that was a long response, but I think what motivates people to fall into those rabbit holes, to question everything around them, is something deeper. And I think that deeper notion is a feeling of alienation, feeling misunderstood, and feeling like they can't trust anybody.
Yeah, no, that's beautifully put. I mean, and to the point that we started with, I think people who fall into those rabbit holes usually do so because they are open-minded. And so in my experience, those people are easier to reach than people who are in the more closed-minded category you mentioned before. So shifting gears a little bit.
I'll just make one more piece on this, which is they fall into that rabbit hole even if they're open-minded, but then that rabbit hole is a community of other skeptics. And they find community in that. And so I think that the goal is to be able to build a counter community for people rather than letting them stay in their own communities that only causes us to sort of realize our worst impulses.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Okay, so two more things. I want to end by asking you about the future of higher ed. It's been an extremely tumultuous year for higher ed. The new administration has big plans and arguably a big mandate to change things in higher ed. But first, I want to ask you on the topic of polarization. One of the things I noticed in your CV, which is really interesting, is that before you were at Bridge, you worked for the State Department for almost a year on countering violent extremism in Pakistan. And I gotta say, I've one of the things that I've noticed is a commonality in a lot of people whose work I really admire in the polarization space, yourself included, is international experience. In a way, kind of, seeing both that the tribalism exists elsewhere. It's not just here in the United States, but also maybe some of the ways that things could be worse than they are here. How, if at all, did your work in the State Department influence the work that you do now?
That's a fascinating question, Matt. I will say that I worked at the State Department while building Bridge. It was simultaneous. It was a work mandate I had while doing it. And this is just my quick side rant, which is I didn't learn too much from the State Department directly, but I learned a lot from the people in it and the environment in which we're operating. So when you think about countering violent extremism, essentially what that work manifests as is how do you prevent young boys, young men, young women from radicalizing in societies that are known as fragile and failed states. And in that environment, it goes back to our point about community and alienation. Folks oftentimes fall into cycles of resentment, cycles of poverty, and importantly, the only people that are there ready to catch them from that cycle are what folks might call in international context extremists. It's how oftentimes different forms of terrorism have sort of spread across the world. And what I learned from that experience, what I've learned from many other experiences in the Bridge context, is essentially what we were doing abroad was countering violent extremism by providing community space, trust, reaching out to people. And that was exactly what we were doing at Bridge. And actually, in fact, I after ditching the pre-med track, part of me wanted to go into international relations. And what actually deterred me from that was because I realized that work we were doing abroad was actually much more needed at home. And the exact tactics that people were using abroad are the exact same tactics that are used domestically. And all of that to say that as it relates to higher ed, or frankly, any sort of locus of society that you look at, I've just found that there's a profound problem, not with division, but a profound problem with misunderstanding each other. And I was banding around this phrase right after the election, which was not the misinformation of facts, but the misinformation of intention. I think we're wildly misinformed about each other's intentions. And I think we associate the worst caricatures of the other side to everybody on the other side. And so as a result, to counter that run to the extreme, we've got to be able to empower people in local communities to create these spaces. But here's the other thing. It's not just about building the skills for dialogue. It's actually creating the social permission structure for dialogue to flourish. People have to not be scared to reach out to somebody and say, hey, can I disagree with you about this specific issue? Can I hear what's on your mind? And we just don't see that environment on campuses, but I think the tide is shifting.
That's a great segue. I think the tide is shifting too. So let me describe it in two different ways. One that's maybe more of a positive valence on it, another that's maybe more negative. So in 2020, most people, faculty, staff, students, reported being somewhat hesitant or afraid, at least, to speak their mind on contentious issues. And that included in the classroom, even when it was relevant to course material, et cetera. And in 2020, and maybe going back even 5 years before that, the data that I've seen suggest that the dominant driver on campus of that fear was what people would call, the left or the woke left or the hard left, basically, a censorious, internally enforced, identity politics oriented, broadly left wing more. And then occasionally there were attacks on academic freedom kind of from off campus that came from the right. In the last year, the data that I've seen suggest that it's changed, but maybe balanced in direction more so than it's reduced, right? So people still broadly report being afraid to speak their mind, but now progressives are, as afraid as everybody else is, whereas before they were less
Right.
afraid. The and a lot of that has to do with the protests related to the war in Gaza, some of which have been pretty anti-Semitic, some of which have been violent. And if you look to the future, it seems like this election is going to continue kind of both of those patterns, right? So a lot of the data that I've seen suggests that resentment for what people call wokeness, identity politics, the kind of soft on crime policies, the immigration policies, the censoriousness, all that stuff, the anti-patriotism, all that stuff that people kind of associate from the left, does seem to have been one of the big reasons that Trump won the election. And it seems like people who were previously afraid of offending what people call woke mores. I don't really love that word, but it's a concise word that people kind of know what it means. It does feel like that's going down, but then the fear on the other side seems like if anything, it's going to continue to increase, right? The Trump administration has made mostly vague promises to bring a big hammer down on, woke academia as they see it. And there are some versions of that could be relatively benign from perspective of speech, right? You could just undo the previous speech restrictions and, stop things like illegal hiring and admissions based on race. And there's others that are maybe more restrictive where, you're saying that if you're not teaching, a positive view of the West, we're not going to accredit you for example, one interpretation of one of President Trump's videos for his Agenda 47. So where do you see the speech climate on campus going, say in the next 4 years, and what do you think are maybe the biggest threats and opportunities?
I really appreciated the way you framed the question as people in 2020 were it was that conservatives and people on the other side of the political spectrum were concerned about saying what's on their mind and feeling like they're operating in culture of fear. Now you're seeing that with progressives, and I think what that reveals is whether you call it wokeism, cancel culture, anti-free speech. I think all of this is just a stand-in for a culture of fear, and a culture of fear is not relegated to any one certain ideology. It is a part of the human condition. I think that people on the left, right, middle, up, down, you, I, all of us are capable of propagating a culture of fear. And I think if we think about this as a problem of being purely on one side of the ideological spectrum, as opposed to, I think, a tactic and a method that people use to win out their way of thinking about the world, I think we lose the forest through the trees. And I'll give you a very tangible example about this. Last Thursday, we hosted an Israel, our Bridge USA Columbia chapter, who's doing just some amazing work, man. They hosted an event on Israel-Palestine at Columbia, right, which is sort of like the Mount Everest of civic dialogue work, if you think about it. Ground zero. And that conversation went flawlessly, and it had people from all different parts of the political spectrum with different ideas. I mean, some could argue it was weighted one way or the other, but point being is it was pretty diverse conversation. And we were actually trying to host this conversation in September, and some of the powers that be were a little fearful of this conversation happening. And we said, don't worry, we're going to do it outside of your bounds, and we're just going to do it. And the success of this conversation, we had a similar Israel-Palestine event at George Washington University on October 31st. Before that, our chapters hosted literally hundreds of events this semester, watch parties, election night events. Every one of these things has shown us that it's not about the left propagating identity politics, the right propagating a certain form of cancel culture or suppression of identity with the way that the left would define it. What it is a loud minority of voices competing for the microphone while the rest of us have just given up. And I think the goal of Bridge, the opportunity within higher ed right now is substantial. And that opportunity is the following. I think that after this election, you're seeing a lot of people choosing curiosity over contempt, or at least being open to curiosity. Unlike what I saw in 2016, where there was an immediate knee-jerk reaction or resistance. And in this moment, people on the left seem uniquely curious. We've had a lot of inbound engagement, and I think people on the right are generally more open to curiosity in a lot of these forums and conversations. And so the opportunity for the university is use every moment of controversy and problem sets to elevate the majority of people that are open to these dialogues. Use every controversy as an opportunity, not as fear tactic, as an opportunity to say, we're going to have the conversation when most people won't. Because most people on campus want you to have that conversation. They're just nervous. They're fearful. That's it. I think it's a pure culture of fear issue. I'll just have one last data point on this. We're seeing faculty as one of the key linchpins to whether or not we can have open expression and free dialogue on campuses.
So what does that look like on both sides? Like on the good side and on the bad side, or on the side of open dialogue and the side of not?
I think what it means is very simply, well, in the context of a protest or controversy, or just in general.
Well, just give an example, like when faculty are the bulwark in favor of dialogue, what does that look like? And when they're the bulwark against dialogue, what does that look like? Just for our listeners, because this is a national podcast based at University of Wyoming. University of Wyoming. So far, I've only been here for a few months, but so far my experience has been it's by far the chillest campus I've ever been on.
Shout out University of Wyoming.
Yeah, shout out to University of Wyoming. And folks like Venn are a big part of that. But I mean, we have debates between students for reproductive rights and students for life. That Venn organized. Election debrief. We had a faculty and staff dialogue that I moderated and a student one that he moderated. And, there are people who had feelings on both sides, but it didn't feel like, a threat to the day-to-day functioning of the campus. It was just like, something happened in the world. Let's talk about it. So I guess what I'm saying is some of our listeners are not necessarily going to be that familiar with the types of environments that you're describing. So
absolutely.
Give me like an example of each.
Yes, I think an example of pro dialogue, pro conversation, pro open mindedness is we just had a protest on campus, and what we're going to do is immediately the next day we're going to create an environment in our classroom where we're going to facilitate a conversation that students can actually decompress and talk about that protest. What we're going to do in our classroom is we're going to ask questions and clarify and set clear norms of discussions about here's how we're going to have this conversation, because I guarantee you that everybody on campus is thinking about that protest. I appreciate that question because it actually provides an opportunity to outline some clear, tangible things that people can do. One of the anecdotes that came out of our Columbia event was one of the students said, after October 7th at Columbia's campus, like no faculty member wanted to say anything. They just moved on. And so what the students assumed was, well, the culture of fear is what wins out. And in the negative side, it's exactly that. It's, faculty members and administrators and college presidents being nervous about student protesters, being nervous about loud faculty members. And there's nothing wrong with those folks at all. This, I know sometimes this comes off as critical. What it is it's asking the question, what is most important right now? I'll just close this piece with this sort of argument, if you don't mind, which is, we live at a time where people wonder, is dialogue and protest mutually exclusive? You either have a civic dialogue or you go out and protest. And my argument is democracy is a puzzle with a lot of tools and skill sets. And so when a faculty member thinks about hosting a civic dialogue, they're not criticizing the protesters. What they're doing is we're going to present an alternative way of engaging in our democracy. And I think that's the opportunity right now. I think most young people my age and younger have grown up with this notion that the only way you engage in our democracy is through hardcore activism and extreme protest. And that's important in a lot of cases. But what I would argue is that there's another way, and that's the open hand. That's let's listen, let's engage, and let's build coalitions of change. And I think faculty have a really, really central role to play in that because they're the adults in the room and students are waiting for their signal.
Yeah, very well put. And certainly one of the things that's worked really well here, since I've been here is our president and our administration decided that to adopt institutional neutrality. So the president doesn't make political statements anymore. And instead we have dialogues. So, he's been very supportive of my initiatives. He's been very supportive of Venn's group. This is our president at Seidel. so you can have institutional neutrality, right? You can have policies on protests that are support free speech. Don't kind of expel people, for example, for protesting after 10 p.m. or something like it's happening in some schools. But also, I imagine don't allow violent takeovers of buildings. Don't allow students to say, hold signs that literally point at their peers saying Hamas should go kill them, things like that.
Well, I would just make
maybe let's stop there. Where should we draw the line on in terms of institutional, like what are kinds of institutional policies that you think would be supportive to free expression, and where do we draw the line in your view between free speech and things that shouldn't be allowed?
My view actually on this is not necessarily what are the right policies. I mean, a lot of the things that you've outlined, whether it's making sure that professors feel like they can say what's on their mind and not feel like they're going to get fired, or ensuring that there's freshman orientation oriented around listening and conversation and dialogue. Or, we've even gone as far as thinking about what does it mean to actually have Common App essay questions when students are applying to college, asking not necessarily, how have they created change in the world, but how have you built a community of people that are different than you? How have you bridged divides? I think there's a whole set of policies and actions and norm setting that a lot of institutions are trying and testing. And I don't think we necessarily know what works yet, but I think all directions point a positive direction because it means that we're experimenting. But this is sort of like the broader point I would make is I think actually the grassroots culture on a campus is set not by faculty and administrators, it's set by students. And that's where I think the value of Bridge USA chapters comes into play. Someone once asked us in 2022, college president, we were having a college president meeting. They said, well, if we enacted these policies, I asked, well, if you enacted all these policies, what do you think would happen? He said, we can enact all these policies, but Manu, what do the students think? And I think that while university presidents and leadership have a lot of material power, students have a lot of cultural power. If there's anything that the last 8 months have shown us, or when 2017, when I was a student on campus, what it's shown us is that a small group of students can set the tone and a culture on a campus in a very substantial way. And I think that's actually the opportunity for our Bridge USA students. I think if you combine top-down support for open-mindedness and productive conversations with a bottom-up activism from students for the need for us to actually create these spaces, suddenly what you do is you attack the problem from a material and a cultural lens. And I think that's how you build a new culture. And I think that's necessary. So I would say that it's a both and approach.
Yeah, good. And I mean, you're totally right that students, as much as faculty and administrators do set the tone in some ways, it's certainly true that even in the ways maybe where they've set the tone wrongly in the last 10 years, often they're following the lead of students, right? Or who, or students they think
that's right,
are representative of other students. So that's a really interesting point. So maybe as a final topic, let me ask you about it. Let's zoom in a little bit on a specific subset of campus in terms of the challenges the campuses are facing. And that subset is the disciplines in the social sciences and the humanities where, survey after survey shows there's basically no political diversity at all. Certainly not among faculty and graduate students, and also not very much due to self-selection, probably among undergraduates. So where there's maybe not as much opportunity for this kind of natural bottom-up approach to emerge just due to the strong self-selection, but also where I think there's this tension between, on the one hand, folks maybe in the new Trump administration saying, look, you've got disciplines, large parts, for example, of anthropology, sociology, ethnic studies, that have a monopoly of public money in a way to teach our students about these subject areas, and really do, on average, have a very activist, politically biased view. And that's a bad thing that we have a mandate to fix. And then on the other hand, people in those disciplines, I think rightly recognizing that we need to fix that sounds a lot like we need to violate your academic freedom in a way that is not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to put that genie back in the bottle easily, even if you try to do it carefully. And so when you're in I guess where I'm going with this is in the subsections of campus that are both, whose subject matter is inherently politicized and political, but also who are so far down the road of being divided and kind of being echo chamberish. Is there a way out that honors all the principles of Bridge USA and kind of doesn't do more harm than good, but also does address the problem and kind of allows for more pluralism in those corners of the academy?
I think we have to ask the question: why did those corners of the academy become uniquely ideologically homogenous? And in fact, I think that begs a broader question. I mean, yes, I know we're talking about the academy, but there's a lot of areas in society that are very ideologically homogenous for conservatives. There's a lot of places in our community that are homes for, different identity groups. I think the real question for me in my mind is like, why did certain disciplines become so concentrated with a certain ideology? And I think the reason is not for some malintent or because, they don't believe anything else or they haven't expressed themselves or they're not open-minded enough. I think it's because every corner of our society is operating in a defensive posture. There is no trust across ideological lines. There's very little trust across groups of difference. And so I think what happens is when people of different, of similar identities collect in a certain place, I think they coalesce and congeal. And as a result, I think they become almost bastions of defense for their viewpoints. And so as a result, I don't think you can actually censor your way into open-mindedness and ideological diversity. I don't think the route is, well, we're going to actually remove funding from a department because it doesn't meet a certain ideological litmus test, because the same thing can be flipped 10 years down the line. One of the wisest points that someone had made to me was, I was on a panel about free speech with a Jewish Holocaust survivor in 2018, and Ira Glasser, who was the director of the ACLU during the 60s when the Nazis marched through Skokie. And he made a brilliant point. He said, restrictions on free speech are like poison gas. There's no controlling which way that gas flows. So all of that to say that I think the solution is to try to incentivize open-minded engagement. I think the solution is to try to incentivize ideological diversity. How do we equip people of a different ideological bend to go into something like an ethnic studies department? I promise you there's a lot of conservatives that are interested in sociology. I mean, Edmund Burke
100%.
spawned a field. So that's all to say that Thomas I think Sowell. There's a positive and a negative approach. Exactly. Thomas Sowell. Now, importantly, it's up to the people in those bastions of homogeneity to be willing to be open as well. And so if a professor shows up and says, I want to teach Thomas Sowell, and then the entire faculty department protests, that's where I think you can introduce opportunities for them to say, for actually us to use that argument against them, which is actually, no, you are against academic freedom. So if we operate on academic freedom across the board, I think you're more likely to achieve success. That's at least my view.
So, and feel free to say this isn't your domain, given the work you do, but if you were talking to, say, a Linda McMahon, right? Suppose she gets confirmed as education secretary. What would be the policy that you would recommend to do that?
To do what specifically?
To encourage more, to incentivize more pluralism and more diversity in, say, ethnic studies or sociology without infringing on anybody's academic freedom.
I would have 3 words: incentivize, empower, execute. Incentivize. This is a culture game. And the way you play a culture game is by incentivizing people to think in a process. And the process that we're advocating for is open-minded engagement. How do we incentivize more people to adopt a certain way of approaching the world. That is, well, what are we signaling for? How are employers actually recruiting? What does it mean to think about civic dialogue as a 21st century skill? I had a great conversation with some school administrations 2 weeks ago, and I asked, what if the McKinseys of the world and Goldman Sachs came to you and said, hey, tomorrow we're actually, just the way that we thought about racial equity in the last 10 years, we're going to think about civic dialogue as a key skill set in our first year employees. That would flip the incentive structure overnight on a campus.
I think that's happening already.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. Empower and put on a pedestal people that are fighting for a new mindset and a new way of thinking. Champion them and make sure that they're across the spectrum, because when you empower people and you show them, folks like Ben, folks like yourself, folks like, the president of UIO, that, actually this person's a leader that is leading this way, we start to signal, and then finally execute. I think you got to execute a strategy that involves grassroots and top-down mobilization, again, not of censorship, not of saying these books should be there, these books shouldn't be there. Again, we can't use censorship to achieve our ends. I think what we got to do is we got to say, there's a majority of people that are interested in this way of thinking. How do we elevate them? And so my hope is, again, that we have to think about positive ways to create that change. And so that's how I would approach some of that work.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That's kind of the best answer I can come up with that question is crack down hard on stuff that's breaking the law, right? Discrimination laws, compelled political speech, and then invest big in what's missing, right? So if there's not enough military history because we don't have enough conservatives, let's invest in, grants for military history in history departments. Et cetera. Similarly, you think.
Heck, I'll go be the first student. I'll go be the first student in the military history department. I love that field. Right. And the only reason I didn't go into it was because it wasn't funded on our campus.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So, inspired by Konstantin Kizin's podcast, he always ends this with a question of what's something we're not thinking about that we should be. So, that question in the context of higher education and bridging divides, is what's a challenge or an opportunity on the horizon in terms of improving the climate for political polarization or reducing it on campus that we're not talking enough about?
Yeah, I really like that question. It's a version of a question that we think about a lot on our podcast about what is your why and what is the hidden why. So I think the fundamental question to me comes down to actually painting and describing to an entire generation, what does the world look like if this succeeds? Like, so what? Let's imagine everybody was open-minded, right? Let's imagine everyone was having a conversation. Let's go even bigger. Let's imagine that every young person in the country went through a course that taught them how to bridge differences. So what? And I think we have to identify what the world looks like. And do you mind if I take a quick shot at that about
yeah, good. I was going to ask you to, so please do.
So here's my so what. And I think there's a lot of so whats. And I think if we don't paint this picture, what happens is we don't have a strong enough and compelling case to make about why this actually all matters. And it gets lost in sort of the heyday of everyday politics. So here's my so what. It rests on two pieces of thinking. The first is that you talk to most young people today, and they'll say that the United States is on a path to decline. Most studies and data show that the United States is at the end of its story. And when you ask them why, a lot of them will say that 2026, the United States is going to be 250 years old. When you contextualize the United States being 250 years old in the context of empires and civilizations, the Chinese Empire lasts for 1,500 years, the Roman Empire 1,800 years, depending on what time you start counting. Athenian democracy around 400 years. The United States is not at the end of its story; it's at the beginning. And when you think about it being at the beginning, and you think about by 2045, the United States is going to be the most diverse democracy in the history of democracy. It's going to be a majority-minority country. Most societies, most civilizations have never been able to pass these types of milestones. If you were a person that lived on Mars and you looked at the civilization of humanity, and then you looked at this thing called America, this experiment, and you saw that the history of humanity was one of violence and tribalism and meeting difference with the gun and the spear, not words, you would say there's no way this thing's going to work. And one of the most interesting ways that we've rallied our students is to articulate that civic dialogue and listening to people that are different than us is the linchpin, is the cornerstone to executing on the most ambitious experiment in the history of humanity. We didn't say greatest, we didn't say worst, most ambitious. It's, as a betting person, you would say the United States, this notion that you're going to get people of all these different views, 330 million people, all of whom look differently than each other, heavily armed, trying to make it work, that's highly unlikely. And when you cast it in those terms, when you cast in the context of identity and purpose, this notion that we're trying to pull off, as Thomas Paine said, humanity's last best hope, suddenly, to many of our students, they've realized, oh my God, we're on the vanguard of something special. And to me, that's our so what. We're trying to pull off something great. And in a society of difference, you got to be able to talk to people that are different than you. And not just that, but build upon that difference. And I think if we start to think about it from that lens, we can actually make an offensive, inspirational case for bridge building.
That's great. Yeah. Certainly, yeah, emphasizing positivity and shared purpose makes a ton of sense. And, in a way, what you're describing flips some of the incentives for polarization on their head, because as you mentioned, for example, working with combating violent extremism, young people are craving a grand narrative that they can be the hero in, right? And so
exactly,
what if that grand narrative was a grand narrative of building America up as opposed to tearing it down?
Building America up, and building it up in a way in which you actually feel like you got a place in it.
Yep. That's great. Well, Manu Meel, really appreciate the work that you're doing. Really appreciate your support of our Bridge UIO chapter, and Van Meester is its president, who's amazing. Thanks so much for coming on the Grounded Not Divided podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Matt, thank you for having me. Thank you to everybody for listening, and Van, thank you for all your work.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Grounded Not Divided. If you want to hear more episodes like this, be sure to subscribe for free on Apple, Spotify, or on the Guided Civic Revival Substack. You can also email us feedback at matt.burgess@uwyo.edu. See you next time.